Did you ever hear the tale of Marka Ragnos the Ubiquitous? No? That's actually kind of surprising because he turns up basically everywhere. So today we're going to talk about all things Ragnos, and I'm going to attempt to make the argument that Marka Ragnos is the most influential Sith Lord of all. Now to be clear, this isn't necessarily about power. I'm sure plenty of Sith Lords, especially later Sith Lords, like many within the lineage from Darth Bane on down, are probably more powerful. But I think in terms of the actual impact Ragnos had throughout history, he manages to take the top spot in terms of overall influence. I'll mention some others towards the end who may challenge him for the mantle, but let's talk first about who he is, and lay out the case for marking up the win for Marka. Marka Ragnos was one of the ruling class of human-Sith hybrids from the Sith Empire based on the planet Korriban, who lived in the centuries leading up to 5000 BBY, or years before the Battle of Yavin. 2000 years prior, a group of Dark Jedi had fought against the Jedi Order during the Second Jedi Schism, and after their defeat they were driven away from the Republic, landing on Korriban and establishing themselves under the leadership of the first semi-modern Sith Lord Ajunta Pall. The local Sith species were essentially enslaved, with the human hybrid Sith leaders like Ragnos dominating for millennia. Paul, despite being the first Sith Lord, started getting cold feet after dying and became a kind of sad encounter in Knights of the Old Republic, but other Sith Lords in the lineage from Paul to Marka Ragnos' so-called Golden Age of the Sith were much more fearsome. One in particular, Tulak Hord, was noted by Kreia as being especially powerful in lightsaber combat and capable of wiping the floor with modern duelists. Kreia claimed that while Tulak Hord certainly stood out even for the time, that most of these ancient Sith would stand out in terms of their power, but Kreia also lied about basically everything, so who knows if she's right or not. Ragnos took control of the Sith in about 5150 BBY after defeating a rival named Sidious in a duel following the death of the prior Sith Lord. Don't worry though, despite being beheaded in the duel, Sidious' head stuck around and became a trusted advisor to the Sith like some sort of Futurama character. Ragnos was well respected among the rest of the Sith during his 150 or so year reign, and his astute political and military maneuvering ensured the destruction of his enemies in just about every way, with his rule being considered a golden age, both in-universe and according to the title chosen for the comic book series of his eras. Which means it's definitely objectively true, and you can't argue with me in the comments about it, but if you do, then it's just going to drive engagement, so make sure you do that along with liking and subscribing as well. Really, the Sith seemed to be in a pretty rough place in some ways, and were ultimately almost constantly terrified the Republican Jedi would find them and destroy them again, which, considering that's sort of what ultimately happened, it's a reasonable fear. Marka's direct reign ended with his own death by natural causes in the year 5000 BBY, though this would hardly be the end of his influence, direct or indirect. Honestly, the things that he directly accomplished in his lifetime are less what I'm going to be focusing on. It's more how he set up the Sith Empire during his life, along with some of the things he did after he technically died, that really establishes among the upper echelon of Sith Lords. His direct or chosen successors would influence the galaxy for thousands of years, and he personally would survive as a Force ghost, causing periodic problems for people as well. His most direct successors as leaders of the Sith Empire were Ludo Kresh and Naga Sato. Sato was technically the true successor, but despite their traditional leadership duel ending in Sato's victory, they effectively split the Sith Empire in half in a bloody civil war, even killing good old Head in a Jar Sidious, a former mentor of Sato, who opposed Naga Sato's plans to invade the Republic after two explorers, Gav and Jory Daragon, had inadvertently stumbled onto the worlds of the Sith, giving the Sith access back to the Republic. Sato thought they should invade the Republic, and Kresh basically thought that what Sato wanted to do was a really bad idea. Sato went out for control over the Sith Empire itself, and invaded the Republic in the Great Hyperspace War. The direct impacts of Sato and things like the Great Hyperspace War are obviously more his doing than Marka Ragnos, but Ragnos had spurred on Sato and Kresh in the duel, appearing as a Force ghost, and was responsible for setting up the Sith Empire to a point where, even after the brutal infighting of Sato and Kresh, they posed a significant threat. I'm not trying to make the argument that the things that one person's apprentice or successor does count entirely in their column for influence, but I think the way that Marka Ragnos really stands out is how he did choose and set up these successors throughout millennia. And it was under Ragnos' leadership that the Sith got to a point where they could pose such a threat to the galaxy, even after all the damage that Sato and Kresh caused with their infighting. The Great Hyperspace War ultimately ended in defeat with the Sith, with what remained of the Empire on Korriban and other Sith worlds like Zyos pounded into oblivion, and the death of most cohesion for any remaining Sith Lords in the territory, but we'll get back to them in a moment. While it was the end of that form of the Sith Empire, it wasn't the end of Ragnos' influence. It was Ragnos and not Sato or Kresh who ensured the survival of the Sith beyond this point in two separate ways. Unlike Bane's much later rules prescribed, Ragnos wasn't about to limit himself to just one apprentice or successor, though admittedly Ragnos didn't so much take apprentices as just pop in on people as a Force ghost and say hello, or choose the right devotees throughout the Sith Empire. Really, we're not at a point where Sith apprentices as we think of them now are that much of a thing. The apparition that he did as a dark side spirit to Ludo Kresh and Naga Sato during their duel was a trick he pulled one more time. Nearly 1,000 years later, he appeared once again to two individuals whom he intended to pick up the broken Sith mantle, Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma. Initially, Kun and two other dark side practitioners, Alima and Sital Keto, had fallen under the sway of another former Sith who had broken off of the proper Sith Empire named Freedon Nad. The power that Freedon Nad had offered had mostly just established the Ketos and Exar Kun as rivals, rather than working towards any common purpose for the Sith. Exar Kun was moments away from killing his potential rivals when Ragnos appeared, and decreed that Kun and Qel-Droma should work together instead to restore the Sith legacy. Alima Keto was literally right there and was entirely ignored by Ragnos, while Satal Keto had already died. Under Ragnos' instructions, Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma essentially made the first instance we have of a more traditional master-apprentice Sith relationship. Something that we'd see later on with everyone from Revan and Malak to the later instances of Bane's Rule of Two, though obviously a bit more restrictive, since Bane probably wouldn't have approved of all the dark acolytes that they ended up with. Kun and Qel-Droma then enlisted the help of the Mandalorians along with other fallen Jedi and the ruinous Sith Lords. Though Qel-Droma's redemption at the hands of the Jedi and Kun freeing his spirit through a mass sacrifice of Sith Misasi warriors on Yavin meant the war effort fell apart, and once again the Sith failed to take over the galaxy. The second way he had secured the Sith's survival came through another of his appointments as the leader of the Sith Empire, a young boy named Tenebrae. Tenebrae had been the illegitimate son of another Sith Lord, Drathima, whom Tenebrae overthrew as a powerful little 10-year-old. At the age of 13, Tenebrae approached Ragnos, who legitimized his position as Lord of the remote planet Nathema, which was also known as Madrius, and granted him the title of Lord Vitiate. When Sato began his crusade against the Old Republic 100 years following this, Vitiate and his forces held back, and when the rest of the Empire crumbled, Vitiate was able to pull together what remained of the Sith Lords, and killed the rest of them by draining their energy. This left him in command of a unified Sith people whom he took to the lost world of Droman Kos. Tenebrae got bored of the Sith lifestyle, and through the Sith art of essence transfer, he took over the body of a Zakul warrior in the unknown regions named Valkorion, and established himself as the leader of the Eternal Empire. I'm not going to go too deep into these elements since we're trying to focus on Ragnos, but this all pertains to how Ragnos kept the Sith alive through his choices with Exar Kun and Tenebrae. It was Tenebrae who instigated the Mandalorian Wars, then lured Revan and Malak to the dark side shortly after Exar Kun's apparent death, meaning Ragnos was essentially only one Sith generation off of Revan and Malak, and the direct individual responsible for the power and position of Exar Kun, Qel-Droma, Kresh, Naga Sato, and Tenebrae, basically all of the most powerful Sith of this period across several thousand years. Of course, many of these individuals had a greater impact directly on the galaxy at large, but I think it's ultimately Ragnos whose individual choices, directly or indirectly, had the biggest impact on the long-term state of the Sith. Ragnos' contributions to the Sith legacy wouldn't stop there either. Harassing other Sith Lords from beyond the grave was something of a hobby for pretty much every Sith, and Ragnos was no different. According to the Book of Sith by Daniel Wallace, the master of Palpatine, Darth Plagueis, went to Korriban to investigate the Sith spirits, which supposedly inhabited the tombs. He was confronted by the spirit of Ragnos, but was pretty dismissive about it all. His account of the encounter said, quote, "The illusion of Marka Ragnos cannot offer proof of its own existence," which I think is kind of hilarious, since it implies Plagueis was sitting there with this big solipsistic, I want to speak to the manager energy, arguing with Marka Ragnos about whether he actually existed. But ultimately, Plagueis decided Ragnos was an illusion. We already have two accounts of how Ragnos appeared before other individuals like Kun, Qel-Droma, Kresh, and Sato, so this was probably pretty frustrating for him. And in the margins of the book, there's even notes by Palpatine and Luke Skywalker talking about how Plagueis was pretty wrong for believing this, to put it lightly. A few decades after that, though, in 14 ABY, over 5,000 years after Ragnos' death, a cult had arisen aiming to siphon Force energy using a scepter that had been owned by Marka Ragnos in order to restore the long-dead Sith Lord to life. This cult was led by a Dark Jedi named Tavion Aximus. These so-called disciples of Ragnos were able to gather all the energy necessary to complete their ritual. But when they made it to Korriban, they were interrupted by students of Luke Skywalker, particularly Jaden Kor. Kor fought Tavion, who was possessed by Ragnos, and ultimately overcame the Sith pair. Interestingly, while Ragnos was defeated, his spirit doesn't seem to have been destroyed, so he'd possibly still be able to pop up if he wanted to. All of these factors are why I think Ragnos is, overall, the most influential Sith Lord in history. He had a major direct impact on millennia worth of Sith and set in motion a lot of the events which would shape Sith history. I think if he wanted to make an argument for other Sith to fit that, you'd definitely be able to make a case for some like Tenebrae if you want to include the point where he was Valkorian, but also of course Bane and Sidious. I don't really think there are that many others that approach this level of influence though. Let me know what you think in the comments. Is Ragnos number 1? Is he close, or is it someone else entirely? Remember, we're not really talking about outright power or strength here. I hope you've enjoyed this look at Marka Ragnos. If there's anything else you'd like to see me cover on the channel, let me know that in the comments as well, and subscribe for more if you're not already. I'm working on the next animated campaign video currently, which I was hoping to do way earlier, since the last one was in March or so, but I'm hoping to do a bit more for the battles in this one, which is going to be on the hunt for Zinj. In the meantime though, if you're looking for some shorter, daily, minute-long Star Wars content, check out my Clips channel, which I'll link in the description as well. Thanks for watching, and hope to see you next time.